Please welcome Atlantic contributing writer Jemele Hill.
In 2020, we saw an unprecedented rise of attacks against people of Asian descent. And in this conversation, we plan to discuss how these attacks happen, what led to them, what can we do about them, and what can we do going forward to prevent this kind of hatred in this country. I'm so pleased to be joined by Lisa Ling, who is host and executive producer of This Is Life with Lisa Ling, which premieres October 10th on CNN, and also Eva Chen, who is got a number of jobs and a very, very, very big title. Um, she is the vice president of fashion and shopping partnerships at Instagram. And I'm also, let me not forget, also a children's book author. Pleased to be joined by you both. And thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. So let's start with where things stand today. Obviously, over the last year, there has been a lot of conversation about the hatred and the attacks on Asian Americans. Where do you think we stand today? And Lisa, I'll begin with you.
Well, Jemele, thanks so much for hosting this session. Look, I wish I could say that things have gotten better, but whenever I open social media, I seem to see more attacks on Asian people, particularly on our seniors. I definitely think there's more awareness about it, but when you stop and think about it, our Asian American history isn't taught in America. And the reality is that Asian Americans have been scapegoated and discriminated against for centuries, since Asian people first landed on US soil. And so while many people have been surprised by this, the scapegoating of Asians in the last year and a half since COVID became rooted here, it really has been just this pattern of discrimination that has existed for so long in this country.
Eva, what are your thoughts?
And what Lisa said so articulately as usual. I mean, I remember the first time I heard the expression China virus, and I immediately had this like feeling in the pit of my stomach thinking like, oh no, like this is not going to be good. And, soon thereafter, I started telling my parents to wear hats and sunglasses and scarves to hide the fact that they were Asian. As Lisa pointed out, so many of the attacks are on our elders, and they pop up in the news every so often, mainstream news. I see them a lot on social media because of the amplification on Instagram, for instance, people like Lisa or myself talking about these horrific incidents. But, they're still happening. They might not just be as talked about as much. But, I just read about a woman who was sitting in her car and who she was punched while in a parking lot. And it's disheartening and incredibly scary, I think, especially some of these incidents happen in front of children.
Eva, as Lisa alluded to, these attacks on people of Asian descent are not necessarily new in this country, but it did seem to reach a different point. How much one of the contributing factors seemed to be high-profile people in leadership positions continuing to gaslight and demonize the Asian community. Eva, how much did that have to do with this anti-Asian sentiment seeming to explode in this country over the last year?
I think there's a lot of othering of Asians where, I grew up in the US. I was, I'm a native New Yorker, and, still when I walk down the street, someone will be like, well, where are you from? And I'll be like, oh, I grew up in the village, in the 80s. And they'll be like, where are you from though? And, that happens to me often, like when I'm even in a taxi or an Uber or like at a doctor's office. And it might seem innocent, but there is a pervasiveness to it that kind of makes people feel like they're not a part of American culture. And it's one of the reasons why I think right now representation obviously is so important, but seeing movies like Shang-Chi, the new Marvel movie with Simu Liu, kind of hit the top of the box office, or seeing books by Asian authors hit the top of the New York Times bestseller list, things like that I think are definitely helping. And also just people being more vocal. I mean, I know that I feel like I really found my voice in the last 2 years, feeling as though that, we have to stand up and speak for others. I know that when I was younger, I felt definitely more shy. And I think there's a part of Asian culture where you're taught to hold your voice back and not to cause any fuss and to kind of just like hide a little bit and don't cause any trouble. But I think this new generation of activists, of voices, is so inspiring to me. And seeing the hashtag, for instance, Stop Asian Hate on Instagram proliferate, and just kind of seeing all the people coming behind it from all different races, all different cultures, all different kinds of people has been incredibly encouraging and heartening for me.
We saw that President Biden, he signed a law that addressed some of this anti-Asian hate that's been going on. Lisa, what did you think about his decision to do this? And did you think it went far enough?
Well, I think that is one of the big differences between the the scapegoating of Asians that's happening today and what has happened in years prior. That the federal government is taking action, is enacting laws, is acknowledging the fact that this is happening and that Asian Americans belong in this country. You know, when you look at what happened to Vincent Chin in the early 1980s, he was a young Chinese man working and living in Detroit. And this was during a period of economic downturn. Jemele, you know of this. You grew up in Detroit when a lot of blame was being placed on Japanese companies because they were building much more fuel efficient vehicles, and it became really easy to blame this foreign power that was coming in and taking people's jobs. And Vincent Chin was on his way to celebrate his bachelor party. He was actually in a bar with some friends and got into an altercation, and two white men essentially beat him to death and accused him of being Japanese. And it was one of the first times that this multi-Asian, multi-ethnic group of people banded together to protest what had happened and to demand civil rights for Vincent Chin. But it didn't get the kind of federal government support, corporate support that this movement now is getting. And that is a big difference. But having said that, you asked about what happens when leaders and political officials, make comments or refer to things like the coronavirus, the COVID-19, as the China virus. Well, it weaponizes this virus, and it allows for people to think in their minds that people of Asian descent may have had something to do with the reason why COVID has spread. And we all know that Asian people have had nothing to do with the spread of COVID in this country. And so this idea of, expressing those words weaponized this virus. And that is one of the reasons why so many Asian people have been attacked in the last year and a half, and so violently and so brazenly.
You said a few moments ago, Lisa, about the importance of knowing, Asian history in this country and how it's just not being taught. And you decided with your show to tell the story of what happened to Vincent Chin. What made you decide that this was a story that you could use to sort of not only educate people about how anti-Asian hate is not new, but also to tell them a story that maybe might resonate with them and get them to see the issue differently? Why did you decide to address this story in particular?
So my show, This Is Life, has been on the air for now 8 seasons. Actually, our 8th season will be starting on October 10th. And it was during 2020, June of 2020, that people on social media started talking about Juneteenth. And I have to admit, I was really embarrassed that I knew very little about Juneteenth. I think I heard about it, but I didn't really know that it was such a consequential moment in American history. And so that propelled me to think about all of those moments in American history that aren't found in our history books. American history is told through a certain lens, right? It's told through the eyes of the victors, and that compelled my team and me to want to really dig into some of the stories that didn't make it into the books. And so we're dedicating our entire 8th season to those moments in American history that were significant, that impacted where we are today, but that we haven't really known about. And the Vincent Chin story is one of the moments in Asian American history that obviously was hugely significant. It really was the reason for the federal government to actually, it was the first civil rights case in American history involving an Asian American, but there's so many of these missed opportunities to look back at history to kind of figure out where we are and where we're going. And it's interesting right now that there's this fierce debate that is happening in our federal government, in school districts, in local legislatures about history. How can we deny that history can play a role in the things that we are experiencing, in the way we think, in the way we educate our children who are going to inherit the problems that we're dealing with today? So this denial of the importance of history, to me, is very dangerous. And so we've dedicated our whole season to trying to unearth those stories to help us figure out how they have affected, how we're living now.
As Eva said earlier, representation definitely matters. And along those same lines, Eva, you have companies like Warner Brothers and Disney who have now attached warnings to some of their older films because of how they depicted Asians in some of their films and movies and in pop culture. What do you make of companies doing that? Is this helpful in stopping these harmful stereotypes of Asians?
I mean, I think so. I have three kids. They are just beginning to get into the age where they love movies and watching, television and really love it. And you watch some of the older movies and there are dangerous stereotypes, not just about Asians, about many different cultures and races. And they're really harmful because children, I think, at a young age start internalizing messages, what's okay to say, what's not okay to say. Of course, they're learning from their parents, but they learn from pop culture, television, books as well. And it's one of the reasons why I think what Lisa's doing with her program is so amazing, because that's educating adults about history that might not have been taught to them. And it's one of the reasons why when I write children's books, representation is so important. I didn't know this was never taught to me growing up, but there was a Chinese American woman named Mabel Lee who was a suffragette, who was, led marches for the right for women to vote. A Chinese American woman who was also the first to attend Columbia University. And so even at a young age, like 3 years old, 4 years old, like that's the audience for my books, I am trying to have that message out there because I didn't have that growing up. And I still feel like I'm playing catch up on my own history. So I do think the warnings definitely help. But even more important is the studios need to greenlight more projects with Asian leads. Book publishers need to find books with more diverse voices, not just Chinese voices, not just Asian voices, but all voices, because books really are a mirror and a window into other cultures, and you want to encourage kids to see the world through that perspective.
Now, on top of the othering, some of the harmful stereotypes that Asian Americans regularly face, there's also something called the bamboo ceiling. And I'll admit, I had not heard about this until I was doing preparation for this talk. Lisa, can you educate us on what a bamboo ceiling is, what that means?
Well, I think most of us who work in the corporate world recognize that there are many Asian people filling the roles of employment payrolls, right? Because there are a lot of people like to have Asian people on their staffs because they're generally an educated demographic that works very hard, but at a certain point the number of Asians who are actually rising through the ranks and becoming executives is actually very small. In fact, Asian women are apparently the least likely to ascend up the corporate ladder. And there I think are a myriad of reasons why, but I think Eva can probably attest to the fact that as Asian women, I do believe that I have been overlooked in my career. I mean, there have been um, a number of incidents where someone who I believe had similar qualifications as I have, our shows performed commensurate. In some cases, my show may have even performed better, but somehow my male counterpart would, receive more promotion or even get renewed for more seasons. And I don't think that it has been malicious. I don't think there's been malice behind not promoting Asian women. I think that Asian women in particular have suffered from not being seen as much as our perhaps our white male counterparts. I think that is starting to change, but the statistics bear it out.
Eva, as somebody who is at the executive level at Instagram, what's your perspective on this?
I mean, I do think I do a lot of mentorship for young women who work at Instagram and do not work at Instagram. And a lot of them do tend to be young Asian American women who say, like, well, I feel like I'm passed over, or I'm asked to do like a lot of the work that is considered foundational, but then not given the recognition. And I think that part of it is that Asian American women often have the stereotype of being more passive, being very friendly, being very sweet, very quiet, and willing to do everything. But then other people, of course, as Lisa pointed out, might get the credit, the recognition, or the promotions. I spend a lot of time talking to Asian women and telling them to like own your voice, ask for what you think you deserve. And part of it is practice. I mean, you may have grown up in a household where, you know, you were told to be quiet or to kind of just like play by the rules. But in this new culture, owning your voice, having a voice, and using your platform, whether you have 10 followers, 10,000 followers, is really important. And the more you practice, the easier it gets. And that's what I've seen for myself, at least. You still get, we talk a lot as women about imposter syndrome, but I think the stakes are doubly, the stakes are double when you are a woman of color. The imposter syndrome, I think, is even deeper and more pervasive. And so I think it's like talking that through and also finding other women to share your feelings with, to kind of, I know Lisa and I like, we DM and support each other in finding your own kind of cheer squad of people to help you through it.
You said something interesting earlier that you kind of recently found your voice in the last couple of years. Eva, what was it that inspired you or just made you feel compelled that you wanted to be more vocal about what was happening in your community and just being a voice, period, for Asian people?
Part of it is having children. Honestly, my daughter is 7 years old. She is half Chinese, half British, and I want her to have a strong connection to her Chinese side. For me, growing up, I've always felt like I lived in two worlds. Growing up in New York City, I was one of maybe three Asians in like my school growing up, and I felt very connected to my Chinese culture. I still speak purely Mandarin to my parents. But I really just felt like a, a deepening in the sense of my connection and heritage when I started having kids, because it made me understand my parents' journey as immigrants better. And that's something that I've been trying to understand as I spend time with them, understanding their struggles. I just wrote a book about the immigrant experience, children's book about the immigrant experience that's coming out next year. And part of that is like that connection to my family and trying to deepen that.
All right. As we wrap here, I want to get both of your perspectives on this. It feels like in this country, a lot of times things happen, incidents happen, and then for the moment, we all rally around it. We want to talk about it. We want to, kind of unpack how we got to a certain place. How do we maintain, for lack of a better way to put it, the momentum and remaining aware about the hateful sentiments, the harmful depictions against Asians in this country? How do we continue that momentum that was created by, unfortunately, a rise in hate attacks? Lisa, I'll start with you.
As long as Asian American history is not taught in our schools, when kids are young, this is when empathy is built, right? Is developed. And if Asian American history isn't taught, it becomes so easy to overlook an entire community, to judge an entire community, even dehumanize an entire community. So while there has been momentum in the last year and a half to combat acts of hate against Asians, we have to have a long-term goal of educating the American population, the global community, really, about the contributions that Asian Americans have played in this country, the triumphs that we have achieved, and recognize the fact that our history is American history. And I think by doing that, having a sort of a long-term goal of infusing the history curriculum for kids and young adults with Asian American history and BIPOC history, I think that will go a long way in allowing empathy, sympathy, and just a better understanding of our fellow humans to exist in this country.
And I think what Lisa's saying is absolutely foundational. You know, Asian American history has to be taught in schools. And I believe one state so far has passed a bill introducing it and making it mandating Asian American history should be taught. I also feel like we have to think about what we can do on the daily, right? You know, it can feel often that we're hopscotching from one kind of thing in current events to another. I think it's really important to keep a drumbeat of conversation around these issues, around these hate crimes, around these racist attacks. It's not pretty. It's not pretty to talk about. People might not want to hear about it, but we have to keep talking about it because it's still happening. So not being afraid to own your voice and share about it, talk to your friends about it, raise awareness for charities supporting Asian American seniors. There's one called Heart of Dinner that I love to support that provides meals for homebound elderly Asians in New York City's Chinatown. But just kind of using your platform to raise awareness and just continuing to talk about it. Keep that drumbeat going.
And
Yeah,
I would just
awareness.
add, you know, it's so important to communicate also to our kids. And you know, Eva talking about these amazing kids books that are available to kids. Read them to your kids, whether they're Asian or not. My 8-year-old was in school a couple of months ago, and a boy called her Ching Chong, and her best friend, without missing a beat, said, "I will not be a bystander," and went off and told the teacher about what had happened to my daughter. And you know, these are examples of, you know, educating our kids to be better and do better. And you know, I think that adults need to take a page from that as well.
Totally. I mean, I can't believe, like, I remember being called Ching Chong when I was 8 years old, and it's still happening. It's just so, oh, it breaks the heart. But
And
it's how
crumbling,
amazing.
right? I mean, I wish I had my daughter's best friend to defend me at that moment, because I have vivid memories of just crumbling whenever I would hear that, which was often.
But how great that your
Um,
best friend spoke up, you know, that is amazing. And that's the future, I hope.
yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's alarming, but also hopeful at the same time because there was somebody else that was there to be a real ally. If only some adults could learn similar habits, right? Well, listen, I want to thank you ladies for just being so candid and opening up and giving us a much needed perspective. As you both have said, awareness, representation, these are things that greatly matter. And I would be remiss if I did not remind the audience that Lisa's show, This is Life with Lisa Ling, premieres October 10th on CNN. Lisa, Eva, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Jemele.
you.